Hi everyone, and welcome to Beyond Tomorrow, a new series from the New Zealand Herald in partnership with MYOB, where we tackle the unprecedented business environment affecting thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises across New Zealand as the world battles to slow the spread of the novel coronavirus. I'm Will Ingrid, I'm joined by Ingrid Cronin-Knight, Country Manager for MYOB, and today we have Kirsten Patterson, the Chief Executive at the Institute of Directors. You're a director as well, right, Kirsten, or KP? I hear people might be allowed to call you.
Yeah, absolutely. KP's a hangover from when I spent almost 10 years working at rugby. It's a nickname that's stuck even in the business community. But yes, I am a director as well on a number of not-for-profits.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey, Ingrid, we're in unprecedented times at the moment, right, with the government overhauling some of the obligations on company directors in order to keep companies alive.
Yeah, it's we've seen a whole lot of legislative change that's proposed. Some of it's actually not been realised yet, and so we still haven't got necessarily the clarity on it. But yes, we did see the safe harbour provisions being proposed, as well as the debt hibernation scheme, on top of just the unprecedented cash flow crisis that's confronting many businesses. And so I thought that what would be great if you are a director of a small or medium-sized business is to have some really practical tips and perspectives around how we can fight this crisis, what those things that we just spoke about mean, and what your obligations are, and how to think about what to do next.
Yeah, Kirsten, I guess at this point, the big thing that sort of stands out for me as an obligation for directors is this sort of like notion around solvency, right? Whether it be liquidity versus balance sheet, but that's going to be one of the key things for businesses as they're sort of struggling through this new COVID challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we're probably all sick of hearing it, but the answer is cash is king. So businesses need to be focused very much on their short-term cash flow and their long-term cash flow. And I think that's one of the things that we're now starting to get our heads around as SME business owners. At first it was revenue shock, that sort of coming up hard, closed down, and all of a sudden the entire economy, for those of us who weren't in essential services, all coming to a close all at once. And there was that real shock, and that was that short-term cash flow, which things like the wage subsidy are there to help with. How do I keep the doors open and while we're waiting to see what recovery is going to look like? And that long-term cash flow now is the things we're having to turn our minds to. What is recovery going to look like? It's not just about when the doors get unlocked and everybody races back out, whether that's to KFC or whatever the drive-through that they're headed for. The big thing is actually how are consumer trends going to have changed, and how's the market going to have changed? It's not just going to be a case of everyone racing back day one.
Massive obligation, I suppose, right, Ingrid, for directors, given the fact that the whole economic environment is changing. There's so much uncertainty, and they have the obligations of the liquidity versus sort of the balance sheet solvency stuff.
Well, I think the requirement is for them to not trade insolvent, and so and to not enter into deals which are unfavourable for the company. I haven't quite got the technical terms there, but ultimately, at a sense of it from a solvency perspective, I think the IOD, Kirsten, your team have done a great job of putting together a checklist which is available on the IOD website, which steps through, if you are a director, sort of the questions you could ask of management. If you're also the managing director, the things to think about. But that really covers off things like your profit and loss projections. And then your cash flow forecast around can you meet your obligations and when does the cash and the reserves run out, and what that burn rate is, and what you do about that. It also covers off things like your assets and your valuation of the assets, and if you've got any contingent liabilities you need to consider out when you think about that short-term or long-term liquidity. I think it's a great resource that your team have produced there, Kirsten, that people can call on, and that's available for them to think through solvency and where they're at. But I guess that has us then go into these, once you've got those facts and you've worked with management on those facts, it goes into the safe harbour provisions and what they mean, as well as this debt hibernation proposal around what that means for directors and companies.
Yeah, Kirsten, what's your sort of understanding of both the safe harbour and the debt hibernation scheme?
So the Institute of Directors was advocating with government quite soon after the close down was announced to make sure that there was some safe harbour provisions for directors. And by safe harbour, I guess the best way to think of that is that, when we're in business and we're out on the sea, it can be a bit choppy out there. And sometimes when it is choppy, you do need to go into a safe harbour and just sort of wait things out for a bit, or have some protection from the wind and the waves that are all crashing down on you. It's something that we've seen that's come through in legislation in the UK and in Australia and in parts of Europe. So it's something that globally a lot of countries have been looking at as to how they can give some protection. We were really pleased that on the 3rd of April, government announced some safe harbour provisions for businesses. In essence, what it allows you to do is it gives you a little bit of breathing space. The same way that we're trying as a country to flatten that curve for the COVID virus in terms of the health issues, what the safe harbour and the government protections are trying to do is flatten that curve for businesses too. We can't afford to have all of this great work going in around trying to, like wage subsidies and other things, trying to keep businesses afloat if directors are scared because of their personal liability that they make a decision to close a business down that really, with a little bit of support and a bit of time, should be able to trade its way through. And that's what we were hearing from directors, that they're incredibly exposed at a personal level. Most have got their house on the line. If I have a bad day at work, or Ingrid has a bad day at work, we'll get fired, which, hopefully is recoverable and we can find another role. But if you're a director, you have a bad day at work, you make the bad call, you can lose your house and go to jail. So, those kind of pressure points really mean that we had a lot of business owners really scared about how they were going to make decisions in such a period of uncertainty. The new provisions will give them some space.
I suppose we should note, though, as well, right, is it's not a get out of jail free card, so to speak. You talked about obviously losing your house, going to jail. In general, all of those sort of existing responsibilities do still exist, with the exception of kind of being able to show that your business has been directly negatively affected by COVID, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of expectations going in. And the first one is that you can't misuse this provision. And if you do, people are going to come and hunt you down and there'll be consequences for that. But what it's there to do is to really, for good, prudent, reasonable business owners who were in a good financial position at the end of 2019, so 31 December, had a good, viable business that was able to meet all of its outgoings and was, profitable. But then if because of COVID then finds itself into a difficult cash flow situation or liquidity position, and normally under those circumstances, directors would have to worry about, am I trading recklessly? Am I solvent? Am I making decisions about taking on obligations I might not be able to pay this coming month? And normally under those circumstances, we'd see businesses start to close down. But what it does is gives you some protection and provision to say, take a breath, make some decisions. You don't necessarily have to apply the same test you normally would, as long as you're acting ethically and fairly, and you genuinely believe you can trade out of this, and you're taking some steps to do that, then some of those normal provisions around Section 135 and 136 of the Companies Act, there'll be some safe harbour for you.
You'd have to imagine they must be being fairly kind in their understanding of and analysing safe harbour should, if essentially for some businesses this is just kicking the can down the road, right? Are directors out there are they in a position to be comfortable enough that they will be protected by this, sort of new scheme?
Well, it's still an issue, isn't it? And the fact that we have to make decisions and judgments, and that is the act and the art of governance. Being a director is not for the faint-hearted. It is a big responsibility. And as I've seen from some of the other sessions you've been running, I think, business owners fully understand and feel that the heart of the business in their hands, it's their baby, I think was one of the terms that's been used regularly, and they genuinely care for the people that they employ and their creditors. So, it is a big responsibility. It's not going to be a get out of jail free card, but what it does is just give you a bit of breathing space that normally under these sorts of circumstances, you might have to make some decisions to close down earlier than you would otherwise, or earlier than you should. And we're hearing that from the banks themselves. Businesses who going into COVID were really good, viable, well-run businesses who, because of the COVID situation, have got no cash flow coming in and are going, well, actually, when do I make a decision about that? If the close down was for 4 weeks, I could probably hold my breath and I've got enough money in the bank and actually I think we'll be okay. But if the close down or the impact on my business was going to be 8 weeks, I'm not sure. And if it was 12 weeks, I probably couldn't cope. And so when, as a director or as a business owner, do you make that decision when you don't know what's coming? And so one of the other things is, of course, we don't know how everyone else is going to be able to bounce back either, whether that's our suppliers, how quickly can they get back up and running, all of our supply chains, and our consumers. So the safe harbour provisions are there to make sure you've got some protection. If you were viable going in, you've got some good financial information to show that you are okay, that you're taking some good steps, you're communicating with your creditors, looking after your staff well, come through that, take a breath to see whether you can trade your way out of it. And if you can, there is a safe harbour to allow you to do that.
Hey, Ingrid, I suppose one of the goes part and parcel with this is the debt hibernation scheme as well, right? And not unlike those, the sort of previous stuff we were talking about, there's also a number of dugouts in there as well that, you have to be very careful with. If you're looking at this as the panacea, it's not going to be right, but it is going to be a big help.
Look, my understanding of it is it's before the step of insolvency. Right, there is this debt hibernation where you can literally take to all of your creditors, a proposal. And obviously, you've got to show that you can meet your obligations and have the cash flow coming. But looking to defer that debt payment, and they then have to vote on it, and you have to get more than 50% of the vote, is my understanding of it. And then on the basis of that, then it applies to all the creditors. And if you can't get the 50% of the creditors over the line on it, then the normal insolvency provisions apply. So it's this step before then to really try and encourage, I think, cash flow across the economy, which is what we want to see. We want to see money coming in and out of businesses, helping flourish things. But it's allowing you to, if you're stuck in a particular area, before you get to insolvency, take those schemes. But Kirsten, you might have more of the technical detail on that.
Yeah, sure. And there's two kind of names for this particular proposal. So originally, and a lot of the coverage in the media is calling it business debt hibernation. But some of the stuff we're seeing coming out of government and what you'll, in terms of the more formal name, and we'll start to see that get used a bit more, is COVID business standstill. And I think that kind of standstill or hibernation is the key aspect of that, as Ingrid outlined. So this is the kind of step where you're not sure whether things are getting a bit tight and they're getting a bit tough, and you need a bit of hibernation or standstill time where, because you think you might be able to trade your way through this, and if you just had a bit of a break from some of those debts, and if you could get the creditors on side with that, then a little bit of trading time would mean that you can come out the other side and protect the business, protect jobs. That's what we really need, and get that economy shifting, and also mean that the creditors themselves, because most of them will be SMEs too, make sure that they're not out of pocket. So there's a process that you need to follow to do that. The directors have to have some good financial information, so you're going to need to be supported by some great business advisors around you if you don't have that capacity or capability in the business. And as Ingrid outlined, the key aspect of it is the communication. What it is a communication tool. So it creates a policy or a process for you to be able to engage with your creditors and say, hey, this is what we think we should be doing. Here's a proposal. And then once that proposal has gone out to them, that gives you a month's breathing space while they're considering that. They've got to vote. And that's 50% by number or by volume in terms of the amount that you owe them. And if you can get over 50%, then that gives you 6 months. Gives you 6 months to then be able to trade your way through that and repay that debt, and whatever arrangements and plans you put in place with them as part of that. But the core aspect, just as it has been throughout in terms of dealing with our staff, the key aspect with your creditors is communication. Talk to your bank, talk to your creditors, keep them informed so they know what's happening. And then that way, that debt hibernation is probably going to be something that's going to be much more successful for you.
Yeah, KP, I wonder if, from your gauge of it, if all directors are possibly behind the debt hibernation scheme, right? Because there's always going to be the chance that a business successfully, taking part in that could roll another business, right?
Yeah, look, that's one of the challenges of it. We are an ecosystem, and we're going to see that more pronounced and as we start to get started up, because of things like our supply chains. Everyone's really excited about McDonald's being opened on Tuesday, but they can't open until they've got the lettuce, the tomatoes, and the beef and everything on site, and that's got to get there by companies who can transport it. So the supply chain stuff really highlights how much of an ecosystem we are, and the debt hibernation is going to be another aspect of that. But it does require you to vote. It requires creditors to be involved in this conversation. The alternative is, of course, that the creditors push the business into liquidation, in which case their odds of getting return are probably low anyway. Everyone will have to participate in that process and make some decisions. I guess one of the key things that we've kind of been learning through this process is how connected we all are, and the importance of us all communicating and being kind.
I'm interested in your view, KP, about what sort of size of companies is it then right to get and establish a board or an independent director to provide you advice from what you see across the New Zealand environment?
Yeah, our research seems to indicate that it's around the 10 to 15 million turnover where organisations start to get a little more serious or structured around their governance. So governance exists in every company. Whether it's the local hairdresser or the local butcher, they have directors, they have governance responsibilities, and they're doing governance tasks and governance duties. It's just become more formalised when you get to a bigger environment. So not every company will have a board, for example. But around that sort of 10 million mark is where we start to see more advisory boards start to operate. Often that's come about through bank lending or bank expectations. The bank will want to start seeing a little bit more independence, and that's through your chartered accountants and through your lawyers and getting a little bit more of that business advice. And at that stage where the governance kind of piece doesn't feel really quite ready for formal board meetings and board packs and all of those sorts of things, I think there's an expectation out there that governance is about control, when actually it's about outcomes. So there's actually very few rules in terms of how governance must be done in terms of its processes, and you can get a governance model that's going to fit your business and your way of operating, but help you with some really great outcomes. But around that 10, 15 million mark is where we're starting to see more independent advice coming in, people calling on wanting to access some capital, access different markets, and wanting to spend more time on working on the business and not just in it.
KP, I'm guessing you would argue now, more than ever, might be a time that, potential leaders of businesses should look at having a board on board, if you will, to give you some of the advice that you might need to navigate through pretty uncharted territory.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing through this COVID pandemic situation is the benefit of having a really diverse board to call on, because we're looking at a situation that few, but very few people have experienced or thought about at any high level. Having a really diverse group of people who can bring their skills and experience to your particular business is just really going to give you an edge. If nothing else, it helps carry some of the workload.
Another question that I have might be for a lot of people, this is going to be a really interesting time for them, because it may be a sort of mum and pop kind of business perhaps, and you may be a husband or a wife, a director of a company in New Zealand, and you may have no clue whatsoever on what that business does and the financial position of that business. If you're one of these people that is going, crikey, I've never asked my partner about what on earth this business does, what are some of the questions that maybe you should be asking about now? I know that obviously you would never advise someone who wasn't a director and trained and understood what they were doing to become a director. The reality is there's a lot of people in this situation now, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really common model in the New Zealand context, not only because we're such a high proportion of SME business owners as part of the economy, but family, really closely held or family-owned businesses. So it's really common for close family members, whether that's spouses or parents or siblings, to be closely involved in the running of the business and to be directors. And I think one of your earlier sessions that you had around the issue of how do you sort of wind up a business or insolvency, gave some great advice about making sure that you have access to being able to ask questions if you're a director, even if you're not actively involved in running the business. And I think in New Zealand, we've confused being a shareholder with being a director. You can still be a shareholder of a business, and it gives you all of, the benefits of being involved in the business without necessarily having to be a director. But if you are a director, you do have duties and obligations. And even if your spouse is the one or partner is the one that's running the business, that doesn't excuse you from your obligations. There's some really great free website information available on business.gov.nz. We worked with them to put together some simple guides about what your director obligations are, and there's some sort of short learning information there that'll give you some tips about questions to ask, things you need to know. Main thing is check in on those finances and that cash flow. Do we have enough money in the bank to pay all of our obligations? And do we have more assets than liabilities? It's no different than thinking about your household income and your household mortgage, for example. And, there's been a lot of talk about if the property market drops, some of us might have net equity in our homes, have less equity in our homes than we owe the bank. It's no different than that. What happens if the business, you're stuck with a business you owe a mortgage on and actually you can't sell it for as much as you need to? So some simple questions, just like you do at home, will really help you through.
Yeah, it's interesting you frame it that way, because I've already done that. I've done that. Where is my cash flow at? If I do lose my job, what does that mean? Can we afford to meet our obligations? How do we need to lift our reserves so we can, and for how long? And so I think that framing around it, and I think now is the time for honest communication. Yeah. It might not have been in the past. You could have left it there, but if you do have this obligation, it is now is a time to lean in and understand these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that communication aspect is key. And if nothing else, the other members or the other directors need you to, because they're carrying a pretty heavy burden and they need someone to share that with. And that's one of the things around health and safety. We've had an obligation to mental health and wellbeing as directors for some time. And this particular environment has shown just how incredibly important that is. And it's actually our mental health and wellbeing that's probably most at risk, as opposed to our physical well-being at the moment. And so the more we can do to be kind, to help one another, to share that burden, the support is out there, even though it feels overwhelming and you feel like you're trying to drink from a fire hose because there's just so much information coming at you. Look for those trusted sources like these sorts of podcasts. Check out business.gov.nz. Institute of Directors has opened up its website. Normally it's members only. We've made it the COVID hub open to everybody because this information is just so important.
Ingrid Cronin, MYOB's Country Manager, and Kirsten Patterson, KP, Chief Executive of the Institute of Directors. Thank you both so much for all the really helpful advice. Remember, we want your questions from home as well. Email those through now to video@nzherald.co.nz. Until next time, I'm Will Trafford. Bye for now.